The brand is the talent, and let's stick with that sports analogy. The answer is you can spend $450 million in the stadium. But if over a 10-year period, the player talent's no good, and there are more losses than there wins, they are gonna be a lot of more empty seats in their foyers, right? No matter how good the marketing is, no matter how beautiful the stadium is, the brand is the talent. Bennies and Biederman again. The leaders of great groups love talent and know where to find it. They revel in the talent of others. Only in the stupid world, a business and government, do we promote the best accountant? Do they have the accounting department? The best salesman, do they have the sales department? The best trainer, do they have the training department? Do that in sports, right? The definition of most of our coaches at professional level is they were second-rate or marginal players, were brilliant students in the game and people, that is, they were good. What a good leader is doing. Leading. There was a guy when I was a kid. Yale University used to win NCAA swimming championships year after year after year. And I never heard the scene has proven, but sure, it doesn't surprise me. There was an interesting thing about their coach. He couldn't swim, but he can sure motivate swimmers. And that's the point, isn't it? It's the thing called leadership. So today we're going to talk about children's literature and the role it plays in society. Throughout history, adults have used the power of stories to entertain and amuse their children. But stories are not used merely to entertain youngsters, they have a significant educational purpose. They serve to teach the moral values of their society. In sociological terms, stories are one of the means by which children are socialized. How does this work in practice? Well, it often makes use of heroes, the characters in the stories who the children will admire and want to be like. The heroes of children's stories, therefore, exemplify the qualities valued by that society. They will typically demonstrate courage in the face of difficulty, honesty, consideration for others, loyalty to their family and friends, a respect for work, and so on. You can see this happening from the fables of ancient societies through fairy tales and folk tales right up to modern-day children's stories. For example, The hard-working ant in Aesop's fable is shown to succeed in comparison with the grasshopper who spends the summer singing and has nothing to eat when winter comes. Similarly, it is Cinderella, the honest, hard-working sister, who wins the prince rather than her cruel, lazy stepsisters. However, there is still usually something to entertain children, even in the most morally instructive of stories. We often think of technology and invention and research as being somehow more sophisticated a proposition than nature, but actually, when we think about it, there are lots of really useful concepts that technology can take from the natural world. People are beginning to remember that other organisms on Earth are doing things in a very similar way to what we need to do. And they're looking closely at what we can learn from nature. Take the bright screens on our mobile phones. Now, this brightness, this effect that they've managed to achieve there, came partly as a result of research into the iridescence of the wings of butterflies and the anti-reflective coatings that moths have on their eyes. And it doesn't end there. They're looking at what makes a spider's web so strong, how glowworms produce light with almost zero energy. The list goes on. And this area of research is called biomimicry, that's bio, as in biology or life, and mimicry, copying or imitating. It's a very interesting field of study. As physicists try to explain the masses particles, they found that if they just tried to inject the maths into the mathematics equations in a most straightforward way, just put a parameter for the massive particles right into the math didn't work. It gave rise to quantum mechanically inconsistent features, so it's recognized you need to have a more subtle way of introducing mass into the equations. That would not spoil the fundamental symmetries, but yet would allow the particles to have different masses. You see, fundamentally, the idea is that all particles begin life has been massless. There's a high degree of symmetry associated with it, all the particles have the same mass is zero. How do you inject math without spoiling that symmetry which is vital for the equations to make sense? The Higgs field does that by immersing everything in this bath, this molasses-like bath. It turns out that the equations allow you to have your cake and eat it. The fundamental symmetries are deeply preserved, and yet the way in which the particles move experiencing different resistance like drag force allows them to have different masses. Machiavelli lived from 1469 to 1527. The philosopher Bertrand Russell referred to Machiavelli's most well-known book, The Prince, as a gangster's handbook. And while there's no doubt that certain people have read and used it as such, I think that if we put it into the context of when it was written, which was Italy, especially Florence, in the 1511 and 16 centuries, it will be easier to judge Machiavelli's reasons for writing it. Now, the Italy of that period was made up of a number of city-states, often at war with each other. Add to that threats from foreign powers, especially France, and it was a very unstable and dangerous situation. Machiavelli loved his home city, Florence, and wanted to protect its culture, history, and above all independence at all costs. One way to do this was to establish an army of Florentines loyal to the city-state of Florence. Much of Machiavelli's career was taken up with this issue. It must be remembered, though, that he led an active civic life, was deeply into politics, and was an ambassador for Florence. In this way, he got to meet and observe some of the key players of the time, and through this came to understand the nature of power and how to hold on to it. The Prince was an attempt to teach Florence the lessons he had learned. We appear to take it as a rule, or as a law of nature, that each species is adapted to the climate of its own home. For example, species from the Arctic, or even a temperate region, could not survive in a tropical climate, nor could a tropical species last long if it found itself at the South Pole. But it is true to say there's too much emphasis placed on the degree of adaptation of species to the climates where they live. We assume that this adaptation, if all species are descended from a single form, must have taken place over millions of years, yet a large number of plants and animals brought from different countries remain perfectly healthy in their new home. Also, there are several examples of animal species that have extended their range, within historical times, from warmer to cooler latitudes and the other way round. Rats and mice provide good examples. They have been transported by man to many parts of the world and now have a far wider range than any other rodent, and they can be found living in the cold climate of the Faroe Islands to the north through the tropical zones to the Falklands in the south. It is possible to see adaptation to any climate as a quality that is part of an inborn flexibility of the physical and mental constitution of most animals. Therefore, the ability to survive in the most different climates by both man and his domestic animals, and the fact that elephants once existed in an ice age while living species live in tropical areas, should not be seen as deviations from the rule, but as examples of this flexibility being brought into action under particular circumstances. The way I started really, I was doing this type of work in United States where there are a number of lawyers doing it and it had not been done in the UK with the rest of Europe before. I think the reason I started in the United States was that there was a civil rights movement. And in the civil rights movement, lawyers became deeply involved right away because if you're black civil rights you're rearrested. And some foresighter, founders, so the environmental movement coming along just behind the civil rights movement in time and said we need lawyers and environment movement as well. As a result, one of the main contributors to the environment now is how has been its lawyers. Here there were no need for civil rights movement, so environmental groups became expert campaigners, but law really wasn't part of the deal and never has happened. They never use law strategically, they would say they have. I came here and one of our interviewed people and environmental groups in UK, in Brussels, and so on and was very surprised of the positive views of law and that's where client came from, so bringing their kind of intellectual DNA and work I've done in the United States into these very difficult cultures. We have briefly looked at some of the problems involved in running a big-ish city like, say, Melbourne, keeping the road and rail systems running, policing, providing food and housing, and so on. In another lecture, I'm going to deal with what we must know megalopolis, cities with populations of 10 million or more. However, first I want to go back in history to when the population of cities could be numbered in the thousands rather than millions. One of the earliest theorists of the city was, of course, Plato, who created an ideal city in his text, The Republic. The population of the city would be around 25 to 30,000 at most. Oddly enough, the same figures were chosen by Leonardo da Vinci for his ideal cities. Now, of these 25 to 30 inhabitants, only about 5,000 would be citizens. A reason for this might be that it is the largest number that could be addressed publicly at one time and by one person, and makes a voting system much easier to manage. Also, perhaps the numbers are kept deliberately low because a large population would be harder to control, or because, in practical terms, fewer inhabitants are easier to feed from local supplies without having to depend on outside sources. I suppose more and more, people are starting to see graffiti as a form of art. Now there are still many who would beg to differ, and they'd point to the destructive scribblings that we see on our bus shelters and our public buildings. These often take the form of tags which are fancy, scribble-like versions of someone's name or nickname. Tags generally have no aesthetic appeal and they are the scourge of the high street shopkeeper in many a town. I can certainly see where the shopkeepers and property owners are coming from. But the fact is, graffiti has been around for a very long time indeed. People left their mark on cave walls back in prehistoric times, and it's been found too on ancient monuments in Egypt and Rome. But New York-style graffiti, which is really the forerunner of a lot of the graffiti that's getting done now, New York graffiti took off in the late 1960s. That's when the advent of the spray can allowed the humble tag to evolve into more complex styles. In the mid to late 70s, subway trains became the new forum for graffiti artists to display their skills. For many young people it became a medium to express their disillusionment with a system from which they felt excluded. Now, of course, the art establishment embraces graffiti artists, and some of these artists have actually taken on cult status. I've been asked to speak today about the purpose of museums, and I think that's something we often take for granted, that we have museums and we need museums. But with so much information available now online, people have access to whatever it is they want to know, so I think we need to consider carefully just what it is that we expect of our museums today. What makes them relevant in the information age? Clearly, we've got to move beyond the early 20th century concept of a warehouse full of old, remarkable, untouchable objects. This warehouse idea does very little to inspire people. What museum professionals need to do, what they should be doing, is make their collections and programs work towards the purpose of education. So whether that means having more hands-on exhibits, becoming involved with other community organizations, they should be doing whatever it takes to think about their visitors, to engage people, to educate them. And in that way, they can be instruments of social change. If they have knowledge and understanding of the people who visit, and the people they want to come and visit, they can take this as a starting point for providing exhibitions and services that are relevant to people's lives. Tissuing engineering, what is it? It's an emerging field, interdisciplinary field that combines engineering and life sciences to create functional biological structures that can restore and improve tissue function. Examples include bladders, trachea, blood vessels, and if you look at it, printing as a technology has also gone through the revolution, and well, it's been around for hundreds of years. In the last couple of decades, it's been a new dimension. We can now print layer by layer in materials ranging from plastic to metal, to concrete, to chocolate, from the smallest scales to the largest. If you take 3D printing and we combine it with biology, we have bioprinting, where the building blocks are cell aggregates where we called BioLink particles that are composed of thousands of cells that can fuse together into different shapes. These geometries can include multi-layered sheets, such as skin, branching tubes for vasculature, and the sophistication of this manufacturing technology improves daily to include different cell types and different shapes. And now, why is it important? The pharmaceutical industry at the moment is in a moment of crisis. It spends more money each year on R&D, but has fewer drugs to show for it. It takes more than a decade, more than $1 billion to develop a new drug, and the cost of a failure can be measured in hundreds of millions of dollars. I want to explore certain issues with you. There is no conclusion to my top, there is no closure. I think over time throughout history, cities have changed in whether they were strategic spaces or routinized spaces. This, our global modernity, is the time when cities are strategic. That doesn't mean all cities, but that means that certain cities throughout the world become spaces where our most acute problems, our major government challenges, hit the ground, become concrete, become urgent. The city, urban space, has a capacity to pull down a lot of stuff that otherwise stayed up there. Take the environmental question. National states can talk and talk and talk for years. Kyoto took years, but in the meantime, cities had to deal with the environment list. When this dog approaches some food, another dog's playful snarls are played back. The dog seems curious, but the sound doesn't stop it from taking the bone. Here a dog hears the growls of a dog being approached by a stranger, but these don't deter it from grabbing the bone either. In another scenario, the sound of a dog protecting its food is played back. This time the dog backs off. These experiments suggest the dogs can distinguish between different types of growls. The skoog is a new university-accessible musical instrument. It is designed to use by children or adults with special needs, or in fact be used by anyone. It's soft, it's easy to play, it's robust, and it can be customized to suit anyone's abilities. The skoog helps students with special needs by allowing them to get involved in making music themselves. It's an instrument that they can play it and they can take ownership of and start creating their own sounds and music. Traditional instruments are the shape and size and made of the materials they are because of the sound that they need to make. If you want to make a sound like a pluck string, you need a string and it needs to be under tension, whereas with a skoog, because it's a mixture of software and a sensor, then thus the computer can handle making the sound. And so we can design an object that's designed to be touched and designed to be played with. In developing the screen and working with kids in the schools and in the classrooms, it's really helped us make the skoog something that's usable by the children themselves. They've informed us massively on how it needs to work, and they've given their opinions on colors and designs. And just the feedback they've given to us has been just marvelous. It's just so enriching, and it's really inspiring to actually work with these kids, particularly when you can provide them with an ability to start to playing their own music as opposed to just taking part through listening and listening to other musicians and really learning from. Indeed, the library. We've all been to a historic library. We've all enjoyed the smell of a historic library. But what is it? And what does it mean? When at UCL Center for Sustainable Heritage, we've recently been asked to assess the environment at another historical library at St. Paul's Cathedral, the Wren Library, an incredible place. And it has such an intensive smell of old books, and we were also asked for the first time. Really, I was actually taken aback by the brief. We were asked, what you do, please preserve the smell. It is so important to our audience. It is so important how people perceive the library. So, that was quite an important message in our research. And indeed, the smell is an important way of how we communicate with the environment. This piece of research was done by an advertising company because advertisers are so interested in how we interact with each other and the environment. And we see that the majority of people use sight obviously to interact with the environment, but on the second place, we see the smell is also very, very important. For better or worse, we live in a world profoundly affected by Sigmund Freud. If I had to ask you to name a famous psychologist, the answer of most of you would be Freud. He was the most famous psychologist ever, and he had a profound influence on the 20th and 21st century. Some biographical information: he was born in the 1850s. He spent most of his life in Vienna, Austria, but he died in London, and he escaped to London soon after, retreating there at the beginning of World War II as the Nazis began to occupy where he lived. He was one of the most famous scholars ever, but he was not known for any single discovery. Instead, he was known for the development of an encompassing theory of mind, one that he developed over the span of many decades. He was in his time extremely well known, a celebrity recognized on the street, and throughout his life. He was a man of extraordinary energy and productivity, in part because he was a very serious cocaine addict, but also just in general. He was just a high-energy sort of person. Well, it's about whether you can achieve a win-win solution, whether you can achieve economic growth which brings wealth in order to cut poverty without damaging the biodiversity. And the argument is that if you want to protect biodiversity, you have to focus on that as a goal, but if you do that, you run the risk of hurting the poor, and you also run the risk of inconveniencing and reducing the economic growth. We use the developed and industrialized countries to see this argument. This axis argued about with, let us say, a government wishing to start drilling for oil in place X which is full of wildlife, and Wildlife Conservation Society is urging them not to on the grounds that it's a wilderness refuge. We used to that debate. What I'm saying is that in the developing world there's a third axis, and it's a complex one. But in the face of the sense of disempowerment, there surprisingly is no decline in involvement in organizations which seek to share wealth and opportunities, protect one another's right and work towards the common good. According to the United Nations, civil society groups have grown 40-fold since the turn of last century. Internationally, the nonprofit sector is worth $1 trillion, and there are 700,000 such organizations in Australia alone. The UN recognizes 37,000 specifically civil society organizations across the global, and gave 3,500 accreditation to the 2002 World Summit on Sustainable Development. This profound movement towards harnessing voices and resources from outside realm of governments and officialdom reflects a profound growth in NGOs, the third sector as some call it. Putnam discovered in the field of local government in Delhi, the best predictor of governmental success was the strength and density of a region's civic associations. This illustration often used is the one that the monkeys and the typewriters. Okay, we have a monkey sitting at a typewriter, and the claim here is basically if you leave chance in time long enough you will get life. Don't worry about it. Yes, it's strange. Yes, it's wonderful, but leave enough matter 600 million years on Earth and you will have life. So, the monkey sitting at the typewriter, the chances are eventually he produces the complete works of Shakespeare, so what's the problem? So, there's no problem. There's no issue, right? You just leave it long enough and you'll find. And 1 key striker seconds, the monkey might well eventually get to you the complete works of Shakespeare, but he doesn't manage to do it in 600 million years. So, what I decided to do is to run the numbers. Instead of typing the complete work of Shakespeare, I just run the numbers for how long would it take a monkey typing 1 key striker a second. To type to be or not to be, that is the question. Right? On average, how long is it gonna take my monkey friend 1 keystroke a second? I don't know how you think it would be. Maybe you could have a guess. Would it be less or more than 600 million years, which is the period life on Earth isn't supposed to have emerged within? And when I run the numbers, to be or not to be is the question, takes 12.6 trillion years to type just that phrase, and a DNA string has got as much as information the Encyclopedia Britannica. Are we saying that something of that complexity emerges by chance undirected within 600 million years? Again, it's mathematically possible, but it's so incredibly unlikely that it would have that it tilts me in favor of the Christian story in which God creating life, simply a question of saying let that be and there was. This simulation shows what you might see if you are orbiting a black hole. The light and position of background stars around the hole are distorted by its gravity and they seem to spin around. On the right, the constellation Orion appears to approach the event horizon, the boundary from which nothing can escape. Orion stars look like they become separated and get spun around. Once the hole has passed by, Orion reappears on the left and looks normal again. Users can also experiment with different scenarios. This is what you might see if you were traveling towards a black hole with rocket engines slowing your descent. Another simulation mimics free fall into a hole. In the middle, the light of the entire universe appears to be concentrated in a bright ring.